So last week we nabbed a load of cheap PC parts from China, but one part did get me a little bit curious, which was the processor. And it got me wondering, given how worthless Intel's old Core i3s are becoming, are those once legendary Sandybridge dual cores now completely obsolete? So we picked up this Core i3-2120 as part of a bundle of parts from China last week, and the main thing we want to do today is throw together a system where we can make this processor really push to its limit and see how usable it is in 2025. So I had a few areas I wanted to test out, such as what happens when we add an NVMe drive, which is something that the Core i3 never supported but should maybe have a chance of running. I mean, NVMe is a bit of an interesting technology given that it needs PCIe lanes, so can this old Core i3 deal with that? And we're also going to be throwing in a brand new Radeon 6700 XT to see how it handles modern cards. And at first, things were actually off to a pretty decent start because we were booting up to Windows 11 because these chips can actually run Windows 11, and things all looked like they were going to work, so we're already off to a great start. This thing's clearly not obsolete. Well, right till you get to the desktop and everything becomes an artifacting mess. And I did try and do as much as I could to work out what was happening, but it was fairly obvious from the get-go. See, these processors were never designed for NVMe drives, so when you whack in a brand new NVMe drive, and then you add over here a Radeon 6700 XT, like a new graphics card and a nice flagship one at that, it runs out of PCIe lanes, which isn't great. So really, you have to choose already, do you want a modern fast graphics card or an NVMe drive, because you're going to run out of PCIe lanes pretty fast. Either way, I whacked in a spare RX 480 graphics card because, let's be honest, that is, well, it's too powerful for the Core i3 anyway, but it does mean we can run things with an NVMe drive. Now keep in mind, a lot of older boards will not actually support NVMe drives, and in fact some of my 1155 boards don't even support new graphics cards, they just don't even recognize them. So, you know, this does make it a bit of a fairer test, but it's nice to see that if you do have one of those weird sketchy £12 boards from China, then yes, your Core i3 can actually get away with supporting NVMe, which was an interesting first test. So while we get everything all set up, just what was an Intel Core i3-2120? Well, it's based on the Sandybridge architecture, which was on the old 32nm node, and it comes in with 2 cores and 4 threads clocking in at 3.3 GHz. There's no turbo boost, but it does have hyperthreading, so that's about as interesting as it gets. You get a decent amount of L3 cache, and when it released for £98 or $138. And that was relatively okay. I remember these things releasing though, and it was very rare you'd actually see them at that price, but they did come around and you could pick them up for an okay price. But talking about their release, were they popular, and what exactly was going on with these old Core i3s? Given this was never a video I actually planned on making, it did get me a little bit curious on the history of the Core i3-2000 series, because the 2120 was a higher clocked version of the original Core i3-2100 chip. So what you ended up with was a, as we said, dual-core processor with hyperthreading that came with a okay-ish graphics card with the Intel HD 2000. Don't worry, we will be looking at those chips eventually, and it was sort of the budget offering that was one step above a Pentium and quite a big step above a Celeron. And for most people it was okay, because most games at the times, most applications, most things you wanted to do were still only using 2 cores, and if they did need more than 2 cores, well, you had hyperthreading to make up a little bit of the difference. So it released alongside chips like the Core i5-2400, the legendary i5-2500K, and the Core i7-2600 series. So it was a weird chip, because this is a higher clocked version of just a normal i3. It's not a very entertaining chip, and there's not a great deal of history out there on the thing anyway. At the end of the day, reviewers said it was alright, it was good for office work, and that was really about it. See, you couldn't overclock the thing, so for people that wanted to get into the world of overclocking, you couldn't. But then again, AMD didn't really have any competitive options in this area. I mean, they had the AMD A8 series, which you could actually do a bit of overclocking with, and it came with a slightly better integrated graphics chip. But let's be honest, we've looked at the A8 series, and maybe we do need to do a side-by-side comparison at some point, but overall, these i3s, when it came to general consumer sales, they weren't actually all too popular. Most people that wanted a dual-core would just got a Pentium, and most people that wanted something better, well, you go for a Core i5 or a Core i7. If you're on the used market at the time, as we've seen before, the previous generation of i3s were extremely good overclockers, which is something you just didn't get here, and they could make up for their architectural deficit with overclocking. The thing is though, the Core i3 series from Sandybridge did become very popular because what it lacked in sales to the general public, well, it made up for in the world of desktops and office PCs. You open up any Dell Optiplex or HP Compact system from back in the day, and there is a good chance there's a Core i3 in there. Whether it be the 2100 or 2120, it was a good enough chip for them because what it lacked in, outright cores, because this was the era of the dual core and the quad core, well, it made up for with good efficiency and durability. And genuinely, when reviewers were commenting on the fact these things are meant to be durable, they really weren't lying, because the amount of office systems I still see running these processors and they're still chugging along, well, they're 13 years old now and they are still doing absolutely fine. So the Core i3 lingered on, and it didn't ever really see the budget resurgence that the i5 and the i7 saw, because as much as they were kinda cool to own, well, you could just go and buy an older i5 or an older i7, or save up a little bit more and buy a Sandybridge i5. In fact, the situation hasn't changed today, because these are now the same price as the i5, so you might as well just buy the better chip. But if you do end up with one in a pre-built system, or like me where it was the only option of processor I could get a hold of, well, they were okay, and that's about all I can say about them. Back into the real world though, and not talking about history, just how was it getting on to use in 2025? Well, out of the box, running a Windows 11 IoT install, which is a stripped down version that usually runs absolutely fine for me on most processors, it did seem a little bit too slow. And it turns out most of our CPU usage was being used by antivirus. In fact, it was eating up an entire core, leaving us with half the processor to actually do the things we wanted. Now, I don't advocate for doing this, but I did turn off the automated scanning, which seems to run constantly, and brought this Sandybridge system down to a complete crawl. And suddenly it felt closer to how a Sandybridge machine should be feeling. Keep in mind, these are ring bus systems, so even though they won't be blisteringly fast, and it was still noticeably slower than an old Core i5 would be, well, it's not too bad. It was actually just usable day to day. We had Steam running, websites running. In fact, you could just throw anything you wanted into it and it would just handle it fine. These things really are little tanks. You could throw it into a stress test while you're doing something else and it will just chug along. But the thing is, you've only got 2 cores now in 2025, and we have long since left the era of the dual cores in the past, and it's weird me saying this because I remember buying an i3, a Skylake one, and at the time, they were doing fine, but that must be, nearly 10 years ago now. Either way, the NVMe drive did actually help out massively, but then again, we are using a hodgepodge of random components, and it's getting by okay. You can still get away with an i3 system like this for day-to-day usage, as a lot of the population still is, with their ancient HP compacts that are still chugging along. The thing is though, it's hard to make a video on the Sandybridge i3 remotely exciting, because these chips have never been exciting. As I said, the previous generation you could overclock and get 4 to 4.5 GHz out of them, and it seemed actually quite impressive. But these, it's a case of they're plug and play. You plug it in, and that's as good as it's going to get. So it doesn't matter that we're now running with 16 gigs of DDR3 and we've cranked it up to 1600 MHz. It doesn't really do anything. But anyway, we are testing things today with an RX 480 graphics card running the latest drivers and a nice undervolt just to give us a bit of extra performance, and trust me, the RX 480 in this system is really not the limit. But given that I will likely never look at Sandybridge i3s again after today, I did get a little bit carried away. So it's time to find out. Can a 14-year-old dual-core Sandybridge i3 do absolutely anything at all in the benchmarks? Starting off the benchmarks, we have Oblivion Remastered, which gave me an error saying that it's only supporting 6 cores or higher, and then proceeded to launch the game. And I can understand why they say it's meant to have 6 cores or higher, because it took 2 hours to launch into gameplay, but I was determined at this point. I wanted to know if Oblivion Remastered could run on an old Sandybridge i3. And it turns out it will run, and inside smaller caves and cities and houses you will see over 30 FPS, but for most of your actual gameplay exploring the world, you will see 23 FPS with 1% lows down to 11 FPS. Now, the stuttering did actually get a little bit better in places as you actually stayed in-game longer, and you would see 30 FPS more often than not when there wasn't much happening. The thing is though, this average is brought heavily down by the fact that random encounters weren't very random anymore, because the game would stutter and freeze, and then suddenly you'd know something was coming to attack you. So Oblivion Remastered did actually work, but I don't know if I'd say this was a good experience, but it was nice to see it actually at least attempt to run on the i3. To give you an idea of how the original Oblivion performs, well, you're seeing 76 FPS with ultra settings and 62 FPS 1% lows, and it's only really using one core. So, to give you an idea, single-threaded performance for retro games, these i3s are absolutely brilliant for, but that's not what these benchmarks are about. You can get an old i3 and have a channel run Half-Life 2 and say, well, would you look at that? It plays Half-Life 2. Well, we knew it'd run stuff like that. We want to see how it handles in the actual benchmark, so prepare for some interesting choices. When I was running Palworld, it sort of reminded me of when you used to try and play games that were far too modern for your Pentium 4, but you didn't have a better system, so you just carry on with this type of frame rate, and if you got used to it, you could actually get away with playing the game like this. That wasn't particularly great, and we needed a 30 FPS cap just to make things somewhat less stuttery, but compared to the frame times in some titles you're going to see later, this was actually relatively successful. So Palworld, provided you stick with low settings, the resolution doesn't really matter here, you can actually get away with seeing just under 30 FPS on what is a completely worthless Core i3. Worth also mentioning now that the i5 of this generation is the same price, so there's no reason to actually have one of these, but if you're using one of these and wanted to know if you could run Palworld, you can just about get away with it. Now, this one was weirdly impressive with City Skylines 2, and I don't know whether this says that City Skylines 2 really could do a better job with optimizing their processor side, but we actually saw an almost playable frame rate on a dual core, which gives you an idea of how much this game is really stressing the first two cores of any processor you're running it on. Now, this wasn't particularly playable, but that didn't stop me from getting over 20 minutes of gameplay footage. So I was actually able to quite enjoy playing through a bit of City Skylines 2, building up my town and my city with an average frame rate of 27 FPS, and provided you could deal with the first few minutes of hitches and stutters which occurred no matter what you tried to do, because this is an old dual core running a rather intensive CPU bound game, you can actually enjoy a little bit of City Skylines 2 on it. Counter-Strike 2 was a bit of an interesting one, as it did have hitches and stutters and they would go away after a few minutes of gameplay, but there were limitations on how long you could be playing this game for, as although the built-in workshop benchmark tells you we're seeing 87 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 52 FPS, this is one of the rare times where actually in competitive scenarios, your frame rate would be wildly different to this. See, I played through a couple of competitive games on the system, and it was liable to crash, it was liable to lock up, and the system, it really just couldn't handle the game all too well. So as much as Counter-Strike 2 does run, if you're going to be trying to do anything remotely competitive, well, these old Core i3s just can't handle it anymore, so you're better off sticking to something more basic like Counter-Strike Source. Now, over in the world of GTA 5 Enhanced Edition, it does seem like things have become a little bit harder for these older dual cores, as we were struggling to see anything resembling a playable frame rate. And some of you might be seeing those normal and higher settings there with HBAO on, thinking, well, that's affecting your frame rate. But it's not. It genuinely made no difference at all. You can run this game with anything from normal up to high, and it's only when you start turning on things like ray tracing you see a frame rate lower than this. So GTA 5 Enhanced Edition is sadly not really playable whatsoever on the original, well, not the original, but one of the bases of the modern Core i3. The same has to be said for over on the Legacy version, where I tried running the game with normal settings, I tried running the game with ultra settings, I tried running with a mixture of both, and it turns out that you can run the game with normal and high settings on a Core i3, and your performance will be the exact same as running it with lower settings, which doesn't necessarily mean it was particularly great. Now, I went into this expecting better performance because I've seen this game run on these older Core i3s and used to see anywhere from 30 to 60 FPS a lot of the time. But it seems like now, with the updates this game has had, that the older dual cores have been left in the dust. And if you've noticed something like this, please do let me know in the comment section, because this could be something with me benchmarking wrong, but I tried this in another system as well, and it just seems like GTA 5 really doesn't like these older dual cores anymore. So it's just about playable, but it's not what I would call a good experience, and nowhere near as good as it used to be. Now, with Red Dead Redemption 2, it was worth testing just to see if performance was actually any better in a sort of in-between point of Rockstar releases, and it very much was in between. It scored 30 FPS on average, which happened when not much was going on, but the moment you were actually doing anything, or the benchmark was doing anything in this case, you would see anywhere from 20 to 30 FPS, which wasn't really all too playable. Settings did make more of a difference here, but it didn't really matter, as even with normal settings in 720p, well, we were seeing anywhere from 20 to 30 FPS, and I don't know if I'd call that playable, but this i3, it just doesn't seem to manage to handle it. Now, you're probably looking at this benchmark of Cyberpunk 2077 and thinking, well, what's going on here? How comes it can't play GTA 5, but for some reason it can play Cyberpunk 2077 and score 40 FPS on average? Well, when you are testing these older systems and computers, this built-in benchmark tends to be a little bit too optimistic on the real-world performance, which is why I've always tended to benchmark Cyberpunk 2077, at least on lower-end systems, with not just the benchmark, but also gameplay. And when you actually go in-game, well, the frame rate halves down to 24 FPS, and it becomes a bit of a stuttery mess. Now, it was controllable. Once the stuttering had stopped, I actually did play through a solid 5 to 10 minutes of the game. And previously, if you told me this is the only way I could experience the game, I would have put up with this and probably got away with it. But it's also worth keeping in mind that, once again, Core i5s of the same generation can run this game, cost the same money, and are worthless. There is zero reason to be playing the game like this, but Cyberpunk 2077 goes to show the benchmark is a little bit too optimistic when gameplay is at half the frame rate. It's always good to see BeamNG tested after all these years, given how intensive it can be on the CPU, and how in modern times it actually does scale across cores remarkably well, something that does not usually bode well for these old dual cores that used to be the kings of gaming for the fact that everything ran on the first two cores. But here we saw 43 FPS on average, but it did come with some caveats, mostly load times, which isn't something I've talked about yet, but load times were notoriously terrible across most titles I've tested, which was quite a tongue twister to say right there. Either way, BeamNG saw 43 FPS once everything had loaded in, but should you so much as try and change cars, or spawn in NPCs, or anything like this at all, you would see the game drop down to 18 to 20 FPS, and that was as good as it was ever going to get. Baldur's Gate 3, I really don't know what to tell you. Things here took forever to load in-game, but I wanted to see if the game could at least launch on this old Core i3, and as it turns out, it will run, and it will spend so much time loading that we actually saw some of the people in the background T-posing, which I've never had happen before. Now keep in mind, this is also running off an NVMe drive that does test out with really good speeds. The only bottleneck here was the processor. And I did try it from loading from USB, I tried loading it from SATA. It's the exact same with Baldur's Gate, it just does not run well on the Core i3 whatsoever. Now, with Black Mesa, I did want to test the Zen levels, as they are remarkably intensive and look absolutely fantastic, but there's not so much the looks that matter here, it's how much is going on. This really does push the Source engine to its limits. And I know I said we weren't going to be testing Half-Life, but Black Mesa, especially the Zen levels, is a benchmark in itself. I've seen this put heavy load on modern processors and even an RTX 2080 Super, so it's well worth testing still. But we saw that it was still playable, which was almost the inkling of seeing what the Core i3 used to be. When you are running a game that really relies on those first two cores, it still gets away with a decent frame rate. We were seeing 54 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to 31, which, you know what, I'm going to say in these last levels of Black Mesa, when things are as intensive as they are, that is actually a little bit impressive, and was the last time that this processor is probably ever going to have a little bit of a hurrah, is this title that pushes the Source engine to its limits, because that is ultimately what this was good at. So, overall performance in the benchmarks went to show that it really is not a processor that is any good for gaming in 2025. Now, it is very much like running a Pentium 4 in sort of the 2010s era, where yes, for a lot of titles you will get away with just about seeing 30 FPS, but it's not going to be a consistent 30 FPS, it is going to be a little bit stuttery. I mean, titles like Baldur's Gate 3, really not exactly playable, especially when you get into those later stages. Oblivion Remastered, sure, if you want to wait 2 hours for it to launch, then you can get away with it. But it's little things, like Cyberpunk 2077, actual gameplay showed that the game was controllable, but once again, it's like trying to play Skyrim on a Pentium 4. You can do it, and if it's all you could do, that is an option. But it's not the 2010s anymore. You can get much better processors than this for the same price. I don't think anyone is buying this processor for its value propositions. I think the people using this processor is because they're stuck with it. So there is that, but I mean, Counter-Strike 2 is playable in basic scenarios, just not competitively. Old titles like Oblivion, the original, are exactly what this thing was designed for, and the last heyday this thing is ever going to have would be things like Black Mesa, where the Zen levels do run relatively good. So you can get away with some gaming on it, but really, I think this is the first time I've ever looked at a processor and gone, yeah, this is kind of bad. This isn't worth buying at all, because there are no redeeming properties, because there are so many better options that cost the exact same. The thing is, we could talk about power consumption, we could talk about thermals, and sure, it doesn't really use much power and thermals are good. But at the same time, if that's what you care about, they did plenty of T-series chips back in this generation, which are higher-end versions that run at the same TDP as this. So there's very little reason to buy this for power consumption. In terms of day-to-day and actually just using this thing, it comes down to the fact of, I can pick up my phone, I can go onto an app or the browser or the internet, and I can just look up what I need to look up, and it is 50 million times quicker than this. Now, don't get me wrong, this will still do your basic tasks, but all the little things it had going for it just don't exist anymore. Cheaper than an i5? No, it's the same price as an i5. Is it good at QuickSync, which comes with the iGPU? No, as we saw last week, that doesn't work anymore. And yes, you can do workarounds for older versions. All of this nonsense. There are little redeeming qualities if you really want to find them. But I can't think of anything that makes this sort of redeemed. I mean, there's extra features, but they don't really work. The most interesting thing was seeing that, yes, it can support an NVMe drive, but you have so few PCIe lanes, you're going to have to drop back on the graphics card. Fortunately, there are so many graphics cards that are just too much for this, like the RX 480. But anyway, that is it on extra performance, extra bits. That's as much as I want to talk about it. It can do things, it's not going to blow you away, and it's not a good option for it. The biggest takeaway from these is that the age of the old Core i3s is over now. For ages they were seen as one of the cheapest and easiest ways into a PC that should just work. You get a HP Compact, you get an Optiplex, you whack a graphics card in it, boom, gaming PC, and because there were so many of them, you just expected to end up with an i3. The thing is, they now cost the same as a Sandybridge i5, which isn't much less than what an i7 costs, so they're in the bargain bin territory. They are literally e-waste. In fact, they may very well be the first thing that I do say is just e-waste, because they're not cool. You can't overclock them like the first generation. They're just a bit boring. There's nothing redeeming them at all, because in terms of value, get a Core i5. If you want power consumption, well, either get something more modern or buy one of the low-power i5 chips from that generation. They exist, I'm fairly sure. Just please don't buy a Sandybridge i3. Don't go out and look for one of these, because it's been admirable to see that it can hold up and run some things, but it can't run them well enough to be recommended. It costs too much. I mean, they're 10p. We're talking about a 10p processor when there are better 10p processors out there. So this video has been nothing other than to serve the purpose of proving that the i3 may very well be obsolete. And it's very rare that we say that on this channel, because it just can't hold up anymore. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this little retrospective and modern day benchmarks. It's been a weird one to put together. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and good night.